Just to kind of give you a little bit of an introduction as to who I am a trainer and consultant. For those people who don't know me, I can see a few familiar names in the participants, however. So really, really good to see some of you again and welcome in to today. I've been doing this for about 25 years now, helping organizations to manage their data, manage crises as well. And actually, I started my career in the military and the police. And actually, I think I probably learned more in crisis management in the military and the police than I did elsewhere, including taking parts in operations like Red Sun, which every country who has nuclear weapons has to do. And that involves shutting down portions of the UK based on a crash-landed nuclear missile carrying plane with, full emergency service, media, and military response. So done exercises at a macro scale to helping organizations respond on a micro scale. So I'll be taking you through the anatomy of an incident and also a big believer in standards. So I'll be talking about the ISO standard 22301 for business continuity as well. And then Kunbi will be taking the second half where he will talk about his experience managing crises in the NHS. Kunbi, I'm not sure if you want to take a moment to introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you, Ralph. So, my name is Ademola Adekunbi, and I'm currently an information governance manager at East London Foundation Trust. Before that, I practiced as a lawyer, focusing on technology law and data protection specifically. I've also worked as a consultant in data protection for a fintech company, and then I worked at DPAS, right? So, it's sort of a homecoming for me. At DPAS, I did a lot of work that involved business continuity and data breach management for a variety of organizations ranging from multinationals to small scale organizations. So I'm hoping that with all of that background, Raf and I will be able to give you quite valuable information on optimizing the business continuity plans in your organizations. Thank you, Ralph.
Wonderful, great. It's an honor to be on here having a little chat with Addy as well. Addy and I know each other from way back, but so it's great to actually present, even though Addy's moved on to pastures new. My animated slide build has unfortunately been changed as well. So you'll have to give me a second whilst we actually talk about the way an organization manage an event. Looks like a complicated graph here, but really isn't. It's a well-known graph. I'm going to call this the anatomy of sort of recovery, really. You can see here a graph with service levels going up and time going to the right here. And most organizations will operate with a little bit of leeway. The green line there represents the service level, and you can see that purple dotted line below it that represents the minimum tolerable service level. Obviously, for most organizations, you don't want to drop below that minimum tolerable service level. That's when you start breaching your legal, regulatory, or contractual requirements. And so, we really want to identify what is the minimum tolerable service for the organization as a whole and for each of its component units. And as you know, normally we operate with a little bit of slack. For some organizations, the green line will be quite close to the purple line. For other ones, it could be a little bit above it as we've got more resource to do what I'm going to call optional things or things that aren't just, keeping the business running. You can see that little explosion. Now that's some sort of incident. That's some sort of business impact. And we're talking here, it could be something like COVID, for example, that we've all gone through, or an IT outage, or a loss of some key personnel, or anything in particular that causes some sort of adverse service reaction. Now, generally, what's going to happen is your business is going to drop off pretty quickly. That impact is going to cause some sort of harm, and your service levels will drop as a result. And you can see that green line diving towards the bottom there. So what most organizations try and establish is what they call a maximum tolerable period of disruption, or MTPD, as they sometimes call it, your maximum tolerable period of disruption. And again, this is how long we can survive below our given service level. how long we can survive. And, for some organizations, disasters might happen at, completely the wrong time. Perhaps at the end of the month might be particularly badly, or the end of the financial year might be a particularly bad time. You might have a legal or regulatory time frame, or be just about to go into doing a webinar. So obviously you've got this idea of a maximum tolerable period of disruption, which is the period in which you can afford to be below that service level. So what we want to do is recover back to that minimum tolerable service level as quickly as possible. So you can see here we've got our first bit of our graph, and what we've done here is we've dropped all the way below that service level, and so our first priority, really our short-term priority, is to get back up to that minimum tolerable service level as quickly as possible. And we want to do that before this MTPD, before this maximum tolerable period of disruption. We want to get back to our minimum service level as fast as we can. And therefore our second objective is to get back to business as usual. This is our BAU line, our normal service level line. We want to get back to that minimum service level, over the longer scale. So the incident happens, number one. Number two, we need to then start our recovery before that recovery time objective. We need to set those recovery time objectives before our maximum tolerable period of disruption. And then three, we need to recover to get back to business as usual, business as normal, right? That's the plan anyway. And so first of all, when we're talking about recovery and how we can recover, it's worth actually talking about the stages of sort of an incident anyway, because for a lot of times, organization might even know that they've had the problem. So the ability to be able to detect is critical to your ability to be able to respond. So we need to be able to detect the incident in the first place. And that means having people with eyes and ears who are open. And that can be a problem, having people who are sort of culturally aware or openly aware, and be able to report things and understand what the issue is. If it's business continuity, I'd say one of the key things is actually your business is going to be so heavily impacted, you'll probably know it's occurred. So that's one of the good things. I mean, this is not like a normal security incident, perhaps, where someone might come forward with a lost laptop, or someone might not tell you stuff. It's got to be pretty major in order for it to be business continuity, and that means you're probably already going to know you're going to be suffering the impact, you're going to be suffering the harm. And so the first thing we need to do is obtain an overview of really what's happened, because we need to take those short initial responses, and those short initial responses could be activating your crisis management plans, making sure all your staff are safe, removing the threat, or trying to reduce that ongoing point of harm. And then, of course, we can then move into our longer term recovery timescales. That might mean escalating amongst different groups in the organization till ultimately, in the longer term, trying to get to some sort of resolution. And then we need to perform a lessons learned activity. And I will say lessons learned about a dozen times here. Back in the military there, we had several sayings. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail, even though no plan survives contact. Yeah. We would say 2 is 1, 1 is none, and that you would have to learn from everything you do. We would call things actions on, or drills, which basically meant you had to do things repeatedly. The more you do things repeatedly, when it's not a drill, the muscle memory just kicks in. A good example of this would be a fire alarm. You ring the fire alarm, and everybody knows what to do because you've done the fire drill 4, 5, 6 times. So when it's a real fire, it's no dramas. Everyone just reacts. So the key is practicing and testing. The key is always practicing and testing, and it'll make your incident management go much, much quicker and smoother, the more practices and tests that you do. So what do we even call business continuity? I think that's kind of a good way to start. And I kind of talk about security here. I mean, you're in security, we need to know what's happening, business as usual is a fair thing that would kick in here. So when we do things like business as usual, we would know the amount of viruses we absorb, the amount of passwords that get reset, all that, the amount of laptops you lose, all that normal day-to-day stuff. But when I compare this to health and safety, they often say, well, we need to understand the trip hazards. Yeah, we need to understand the trip hazards to avoid them escalating into something bigger. It's better that somebody reports the trailing cable than somebody falls over and hurts themselves, right? So we're going to call them the difference between an event and an incident. In the event, we know something has happened that could cause us harm, but we need to then go and investigate to determine if it is causing us harm. So a lost laptop is a good example of an event because that laptop could be encrypted. There could be nothing of value on it. Yes, okay, the laptop needs to be replaced, and that's an impact, but it's not quite the same as having, an unencrypted laptop with everybody's data on it, which is then picked up and used and recorded by the media, right? So there's a difference between an event and an incident. Incidents we can deal with, we can start to take some sort of corrective action. Then there are major incidents. You'll know a major incident because the senior management will need to be in a room right now. Yeah. So the senior management will need to be in a room right now for a major incident. And often the senior management will then need to be engaged as well, press, media, who knows, right? When it becomes business continuity is when it becomes sort of business critical. When we're starting to lose our service delivery is creeping below those acceptable levels, going from that normal service level below that minimum tolerable service level. And that's really when we start to have to invoke business continuity, when the disaster or the event or the incident is such that our service levels fall below that which we would expect. I'm a big fan of standards, big fan of ISO standards, and therefore those ISO standards, the ISO here is the international standard now 22301. 22301. In fact, I was responsible for the first joint certification between 22301 and 27001 years ago, 2005, for a company called Sapura down in Reading. And what they did is they combined the ISO 27001 security framework with the business continuity management life cycle. And so the business continuity management life cycle is all about being able to understand the organization, right? Know yourself. That's always the planning stage. The planning stage is understanding yourself. You have to ask yourselves the question and ask each person inside the organization a rather horrible question, which is, how long can we cope without you? you know, how long is it before our business goes under if we don't have you? If I lose you or your resources or you're unable to deliver for a certain period of time, what's the legal, regulatory, contractual, profitability impact on not having you for a certain amount of time? And so we can ask at a micro scale, what happens if I don't have you? And that's really useful to help us develop plans, help us develop what I'm going to call a BURP, a business unit recovery plan. Yeah, a business unit recovery plan. So on a micro scale, we can have business units understanding what they need to operate effectively and then what resources they need to get themselves back up and running. We're going to call these business unit recovery plans. On a macro scale, we need to understand the various things that could happen. Call them scenarios, if you like. Scenarios, if you like. Fire, flood, theft, big security incident, data breach, loss of key personnel, COVID, pandemic, you name it. These are risks to the organization. Loss of a key customer might be a classic one. Unable to access our building, that's a classic one. And so understanding all those risks or scenarios that take place, and then on a macro scale, we can come up with scenario recovery plans. So when we link together these scenario recovery plans and these business unit recovery plans with what I'm going to call a crisis management plan, all of a sudden our handling of an incident becomes that much more interesting and that much more efficient. Because all the senior management have got to do is implement that crisis management plan, implement that incident response plan. And then they can look and say, what scenario is it? A, B, C, or D? Right, we'll activate that scenario response plan. Which business units are affected? A, B, C, D, E, or F? And then we can tell those business units to activate their business unit recovery plans. And then it should be as easy as that because people have practiced. Yeah, people have practiced those scenario recovery plans. People have practiced the business unit recovery plans. People know how they've been affected. People know what they need to get back to their minimum service level within that recovery time objective. And then it should just be a case of the senior management sitting back and letting people execute those plans. Now, that sounds like a lot of wishful thinking, right? That sounds a lot of wishful thinking. So what we then need to do, as well as understand the organization, is make sure that all that other stuff is in place. Determine what strategies and recovery plans you need, and then develop that crisis management response. And then most importantly, as I'm going to say to you a million times a day, test, exercise, and then maintain and improve. Test, exercise, maintain and improve. Okay. So just to remind you, we're going to have this idea of understanding the organization. So that means doing what we sometimes call a BIA, a business impact analysis. And all a business impact analysis is to say, what's critical? What underpins? What order do things have to recover in? What do they need in order to recover? Do we need IT up first? Do we need finance up first? Do we need HR up first? What order do they need to recover in? Where are our priorities? And what resources do they need in order to operate effectively? So we need to identify what parts of our business are critical. What's the impact of not having them? Therefore, the maximum time in which we can have to recover, that maximum tolerable period of disruption. What minimum level of service we can get away with in order to hit our legal, regulatory, and contractual requirements, and what they depend on, what resources they need in order to get them back up and running. So those business impact analysis will lead you to what I'm going to call BURPs, business unit recovery plans, so that every unit is trained and tested in how they're going to get back up to standing. And then, of course, there's the actual scenario that's happened. Is the building burning down? Is the building flooded? Are people off ill because of COVID? Have we lost the key individuals? They're all our scenarios, right? Our scenarios. So we look at our risk assessment here to look at things that might help you or hinder you throughout the recovery process. And they will come out with those scenario recovery plans as well. And you'll find that, for example, some scenarios require a similar response. If the building is flooded and nobody can get into it and use it, or everyone's got COVID, they might need to work from home. So similar response for multiple scenarios. Then obviously we need to test and learn as we start to recover different parts of our business over time. Obviously not all at the same time. There needs to be a program where we sample, test and learn different parts of the organization at different points, because we don't want to cause ourselves a business continuity problem by testing too much or too hard, or actually removing critical parts of the business at critical times. So, testing those business continuity plans, when you do have a fire drill, you've got to evacuate the building. And that means you're actually going to suffer a business impact simply by carrying out the drill. So, the more we're going to separate out our testing plan and do things piecemeal over time, the better. And then we then need to have the management educated to run a crisis. And that's actually more difficult than you think. There is some skills needed to run a crisis. So doing desktop testing plans of that incident plan, I find the most valuable things ever. So you need to understand what that emergency response procedure looks like and who's going to be in command and control. Typically the senior management are going to be what we call gold command. They're going to be outwards facing, talking to the media, talking to various stakeholders, coordinating the entire thing in some sort of crisis command recovery center. Then we have what we call a silver command, which are going to be tactical, sort of running the piece instead of being the spokespeople for the organization. They're actually going to make sure that those critical activities are going to be recovered within the given timescales and reporting back to the senior management. And then there's the actual people out there doing the work. Yeah, the actual people out there doing the work. The people out there who are going to deliver and recover those critical activities. I find this normally works best with some sort of PowerPoint where you can go in, get the senior management in a room, give them their scenario and say, hey, this has happened. What do you do? I normally find it takes them a long time to even pick up the crisis management plan and read it, the instant recovery plan and read it. So lesson number one, pick up and learn and read your recovery plans. Okay. Lesson number two, I actually find that they don't write stuff down, where people are, what they're doing, all that kind of interesting stuff, because that means that people, what you actually might do in the first couple of hours might seem silly when you look back on it in hindsight, but given what you knew at the time, it was the best thing you could have done. So quite often, just getting people to write down, having secretarial support, knowing where everyone is and what everyone's doing, can really save you later on, especially if there is police or insurance involved. So again, my lesson here is to test, test, and test, and to learn, learn, and learn. It's not just a case of developing and understanding yourself and having those plans, but the big moral of the story is once you've got those recovery plans for scenarios, the business unit recovery plans for individual units to recover, and then the instant or crisis management plan that's going to actually enable you to manage the crisis altogether, to make sure that those individual components are all working and working together. And then most importantly, if you do find there are problems during your testing, you learn, you write them down, you find out what didn't work effectively, what made the organization not be able to recover in the timescales that it wanted to, and then take the right improvement activities so that in the event of an actual crisis, it's just another drill. I know I want to hand over to Adi here, or Kunbi here, who very kindly is going to talk to us about an actual real world example. So over to you, Kunbi.
Thank you very much, Ralph. So I'm just going to share my screen with some slides now. I'm hoping everyone can see that. Yes. Ralph, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much, Ralph. I'm sure that everyone has a very solid understanding of business continuity and what it entails. And this part of the presentation of the discussion about what happened in the NHS, I think is going to be able to bring it home to people in terms of how you relate with incidents like that when they occur. And it will always occur and come to you as a shock, the same way it did to us back in July. So just for some background, as part of my role, I review incidents and data breaches that happen across the trust. So usually that involves information governance breaches as well as digital breaches. So sometimes we get some notification about a piece of software that's not working, and that's not something for us in IG, so we just pass that on to digital. And on this particular day, there just seemed to be a deluge of similar, incidents. So people saying, I can't access emails, I can't access System 1, I can't access Rio, and on and on. So it was clear then that there was a huge issue happening. And as a result, we then obviously did some investigation, figured out that this was something happening beyond just our trust, beyond just the NHS, and actually extending, globally. So the slide here just gives an overview of what that looked like for organizations around the world. For the NHS in particular, this is a breakdown of the kinds of impact that it had. So first, because staff were unable to access records, were unable to initiate appointments or send notifications. Appointments were cancelled, procedures were cancelled, there was a disruption in communication, there were challenges in accessing critical systems and patient data. But for our purposes here, given the focus on data protection, some of the most important things top of mind for my team at that time was first whether there was a risk that there would be unauthorized access to data, because if the system was down and it wasn't clear which part was down, would it then mean that access controls were inactive? Would it then mean that some information that had been kept under secure lock and key will then be randomly available to anybody who had that link on the internet? Those were the kinds of things that we were looking at, and we're scrambling to figure out if we could remediate before it became a larger issue. So there were also obviously the issues around care provision, because as we all know, the availability of data is a component of data protection as well. Making that data available to the people who need to use it is also a factor for us, and that failure therefore was something that was of great concern to us. And then lastly, the actual disruption to our own functions as a department, given that obviously processing subject access requests, for instance, involve going into patient records, and we couldn't do that because the systems were down, which meant obviously that deadlines were likely to be breached and things like that. Obviously, in such circumstances, we would be able to make the case to both the patient, both the requester, and the ICO, if necessary, to say, this was a force majeure sort of situation. It was out of our control. But obviously, we would prefer to avoid such circumstances. So that's what we were focused on resolving at that time. Those 3 points in particular in relation to data protection for my team as information governance. Now, what did we do as the NHS in general, right? It was first to activate the incident response plans that were in place in the various services. So the way it works is that the various services, depending on their specific business needs, have different business continuity protocols and response plans. So each service then began to implement those on a case-by-case basis to make sure that they could still, to the best extent possible, provide care to our service users. Then communications. So on our end as information governance, in collaboration with the digital team, we communicated with all the services to let them know, in case some people had not yet realized that, this was something that was global, this was something that had no end date and time in sight yet. Some people might just have thought, okay, it's 10 a.m. I tried, it didn't work. I'm going to try at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And if it doesn't work, I'll try tomorrow. You need to let them know upfront as quickly as possible that actually there's a major crisis and you need to implement your business continuity protocols, because there's no target date. It's not a drill, to quote from Ralph, it's not a drill where we know the exact time when it's going to terminate and things are going to return to business as usual. So we then communicated with everyone to let them know. As for patients as well, they got communications letting them know that due to circumstances outside of our control, there might be impact on the appointments or other engagements that they were having with the trust. And obviously, given limited resources, given limited technical resources, it then became a question of prioritizing critical services and patient care. Now, this was not our department in IG, this was a clinical function. And then obviously, wherever possible, alternative solutions and workarounds were utilized. So we then, at this point, had to authorize the access by certain members of staff of patient phone numbers and email addresses that they ordinarily would not have, because the electronic patient records had automated systems for sending notifications about appointments and things like that. But in the circumstances, it was appropriate to then give people phone calls directly or SMS them or email them directly to be able to sort out appointments, to be able to sort out their procedures to the best extent possible. The point of all of this is that this worked better in some places than it did in others. It worked in some services much better than it did in others. And
Adi, I can see a couple of people who got their hands up. Apologies for
I see.
interrupting. Just a reminder to people who have got their hand up, if you want to ask a question, we've got no audio from you, so you're just going to have to type it in and into the Q&A, and we'll answer it in the Q&A if that's okay. Sorry, couldn't be for interrupting.
Thank you very much, Ralph. So just to say that I'm going to come to a lessons learned. Actually, let's go there now. In a lessons learned section, which is my last slide, after which I'm going to hand over back to Crystal and we can take questions. But one of the key things that we learned, as Ralph highlighted, is that the biggest determinant of how well services were able to transition to their business continuity protocols was simply how much time and effort they had put into their practicing those protocols. Themselves on how to respond in the variety of situations. We found that they were much better at responding. We found that they were quicker to respond and that they mitigated the risk to patients and service users and carers much better than those that did not. So, because one of the things that we always used to ask, and we updated our breach assessment form as a result of this, because one of the things that we always used to ask when breaches happened in the past was, so do you have a business continuity plan in place, right? And typically everybody would answer yes. It's an easy question to just tick the box and say, yes, we do. And in reality, if you ask many of the people who are ticking that box where that business continuity plan was located and what its contents were, very few people would be able to answer in detail. So as a result of this incident, we then updated our practices to also include questions around how regularly the team practices that continuity protocol and how well members of the team are trained to implement them at short notice. So again, that's just emphasizing that one of the key things here is practice, practice, practice. Now, with regard to lessons learned, right, generally speaking, and with a focus on data protection, one of the first ones is that dependency and lack of redundancy are key risks that organizations need to bear in mind. And this applies in respect of whether the breach is going to be as a result of a loss of data availability, or whether it's going to be as a result of, for instance, ransomware, where the data is locked down and you have no recourse unless you pay X amount in Bitcoin to X group of hackers from X country. Now, having proper backups in place is something that's extremely key. And when I was at DPAS and we used to do data protection impact assessments, that's one of the things that used to be a core focus, because it was important to ensure that our clients have a lot of redundancy in place to prevent the risk that a loss of availability would result in a loss of the ability to continue functioning as an organization. So the point here was for us, and should be for you in your organizations, to assess how you can incorporate redundancy into your processes to make sure that your backups have backups, and those backups also have backups if necessary, depending on how critical, specific parts of your databases are. Then the second thing is transparency and communication. And transparency and communication applies both internally and externally. First, in respect of keeping staff members abreast of what's happening, of what issues are coming up in terms of where there's downtime, where you suspect that there might be unauthorized access or some other risk to your data. So I've already spoken about cloud backups. And with regard to privacy considerations, it's very crucial to evaluate whether you have any reporting obligations. At DPAS again, I recall that we had a client where a multinational client, and there was a breach that they had experienced, which then required them to report across a large number of countries because they operated globally. So those are the kinds of things that you need to begin to assess from the very beginning of when you become aware that there has been a breach or any other incident that has triggered your business continuity protocols, making sure that you have the processes in place to fulfill all the compliance requirements that you have, whether that's in terms of responding to subject access requests on time, despite, or FOI requests, despite the issues you're having, or reporting if the breaches meet the threshold for reporting. And then lastly, I've spoken about this earlier, but it's training, training, training. You need to have training to be sure that people know what to do, because you might be surprised to find that the incident actually makes it impossible to find your business continuity plan. So what happens if your business continuity plan is on your shared drive? And then because your computers have been locked by hackers, nobody can find the business continuity plan, right? And so everybody sat there trying to figure out and trying to recall from memory, what are we supposed to do first? Who are we supposed to notify? And things like that. So you need to make sure that to the best extent possible, people have the business continuity protocols as second nature, like Ralph put it, muscle memory. And you need to make sure that you have backups, you need to make sure you communicate transparently, and you need to make sure that wherever possible, you put redundancy in place to avoid complete loss of ability to operate. So that's from my end with regard to that case study. Ralph, are there any points you'd like to raise before Crystal then? Any questions? I guess we can take them now.
Yeah, I mean, for those people that want to write in questions, please do that. That would be fantastic. We do have a few minutes left. Both Kunbi and myself talked rather quickly, actually, because I think we were conscious that we'd lost a bit of time at the start of the webinar. So just to kind of go back, Kunbi's kind of given a really, really useful real life example there. When the CrowdStrike Microsoft outage hit 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 the NHS, and then going into all those phases that we kind of talked about, and I think as Kumbi said, even though that they had a sort of a well-developed disaster recovery process, I think, correct me if I'm wrong here, Kumbi, you said that the most obvious differences were the people who hadn't tested it, yeah?
Yes, that is
Um,
correct.
yeah, the people who hadn't tested it, and I think that chimes with my own experience as well. They say if you fail to plan, you plan to fail, right? And therefore, it's those people who will have tested and will have done their disaster recovery, who will have developed that muscle memory, have found that. I can see we've got a question in here. It says, looking ahead, what emerging trends do you see impacting business continuity planning, and how should organizations prepare for those changes? So what's the business continuity of changing your business continuity? Kunbi, perhaps you can answer that one first. What trends do you see in business continuity at the moment?
Yes. So the first thing is that the very nature of business continuity makes it uh, difficult to identify trends, right? Because the essence of business continuity is that something has happened that we didn't expect to happen, right? And the things that we don't expect to happen are constantly changing. But I can tell you that the sorts of trends have to do with, hackers and ransomware. That has been a constant problem of recent. And in terms of how to respond to that, what organizations, to my knowledge, have been doing is to honestly have backups of backups of backups to ensure that they don't have to pay ransoms, for instance, because people have found that paying that actually doesn't, bring out the outcome that they desire in many cases. So I would say in terms of business continuity, it's just, being as broad as possible in your assessment of what the possible risks are, because the risks, honestly, always come out of left field. So you want to be as broad as possible
Yeah,
in preparing for them.
it is impossible to prepare for everything. It's really interesting, when we start talking about hypotheticals, people sort of roll their eyes. What would you do if a meteor hit the Earth, or there was a massive zombie attack, right? That being said, there's a very famous FOI request on Bristol Council where they have actually drawn together a business continuity plan in case of zombie attack. So that one's an interesting one. I mean, I work in data the same as Kumbi does. Therefore, all the emerging trends I'm seeing in business continuity are driven from the same old security and AI type events that we're seeing sort of dominating the world everywhere else. But don't forget about the non-technical events as well. AI, infections. It was really interesting when I used to look at things like COVID, and talk about pandemics, people would roll their eyes. You go, oh, pandemics, like that'll ever happen. And you saw what happened in 2019. So we've got another question here, with a very quick question to answer. Will the recording be sent out? There'll be links sent to the people for the materials of the people who registered for the webinar. So that's a yes. And I think we've got one final question here. What metrics or indicators do we recommend for measuring the success of a business continuity plan, and how can they use it to improve their future efforts? So I think the biggest one for me, and Kumbi, feel free to chime in here, but it's that testing plan. How far have we got through the testing plan? Have organizations practiced recovery? Do people know what to do? Have the management looked at different scenarios and tabletop plans? Is there activity around the business continuity being upgraded and improved rather than documents that no one has ever looked at? I think they're the best metrics for me is around that testing and training. Can be yourself.
I think so, yes. I agree completely. I think that it's pointless to have a business continuity plan if people are not familiar with it enough to implement it in times of crisis. The very nature of business continuity, as we said earlier, is that something is happening that's extremely deleterious to the business or to the organization. Therefore, people are not in the same state of mind as they would be in your usual Monday meetings or Friday meetings before everybody goes home or to the pub. It means then that it must be in their muscle memory. It must be to the best extent possible something that they know the fundamentals offhand, essentially. So I would say that testing and training, reviewing, like Ralph said, and making changes and updates as required is the most important thing.
Okay, we've now got a load more questions just come in, but we're going to run out of time. So what I would say is we're going to hand back over to Crystal now, just to run through the last, just some messages from Deepas. But if you do have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to myself, Kunbi, and of course Deepas themselves. And we can follow up on those questions that we haven't been able to answer today. Again, sorry for the shortness of time. But we'd love to follow up with those questions. I mean, Jamal Dean's put a couple of questions in there. I'm sure we can follow up with him and others after the course. But for now, I'll hand you back over to Crystal.
Hi, thanks, Ralph. I really did just want to firstly apologise for the delay in starting the webinar, which is a little bit funny considering we're doing a business continuity planning. But also thank Ralph and Kunbi for a really interesting session looking at business continuity and resilience. We really hope you've been able to take some information from it and apply it to your own business intelligence and your own business practice. As I explained at the start, Deepas do offer many services. Some of them are listed in the slide. And we will be sending you a feedback form following the closure of this webinar, and to keep your eye out on LinkedIn and other sources and social media, because Deepas do regularly do free webinars to attend. And if you look at our website, we have some blogs with some quite interesting bits of information on there as well, some lunchtime reading for you all. But no, thank you, Ralph. Thank you, Kumbi. Really appreciate your time today. Okay.
Wonderful. One final thing, just to say is that we've got Deepas have got a conference coming up in January, so look out for more information. Sorry, February, 6th of February. Apologies, at the Paintworks in Bristol. So look out for that conference. Hope to see you all there. And a final thank you from us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.